Hi, this is Jen Strouser from Dizzy Quilter. Today we're going to make this block behind me. It's the circle play quilt. You can find the full tutorial at dizzyquilter.com, and the pattern is available at Craftsy. This is the first of a series of 12 blocks that I'm going to make. All of them will be using this circle template, and I hope you enjoy it. I have my tools that I need here. I'll put this one here too. To make my circle block for the month of January. The first step is to take pattern B, the pattern B piece of the template, and cut out my background fabric, which I've done already. And you can see on the template here, there's a marking for that's the midway point. You're going to mark that up to the bottom piece. So I transfer that over to my fabric. And then, those can be set aside for right now. What we're going to focus on now is pattern A, or template A. And I'm going to lay this on top of a piece of just regular old copy paper. It doesn't have to be anything special. Get rid of this glare here. And cut it out. And to mark it, this one I've drawn on, but when you do it yourself, when I do it myself, I just fold it for these. It's a little bit easier, so I fold it in half, and then I fold it in half again. And that saves the step of having to mark the halfway point on there for me, so I don't have to do that when I mark them back up. And it also makes it's easier to see. In typical foundation paper piecing, you line up your fabric on the back side and sew from the side with the lines, but if you're a beginner, that can be a little tricky. This way you've got the lines on both sides. It's really easy to work with. And I'm going to deviate a little bit from my directions here. You're supposed to cut out rectangles. I've done this before, and I was trying to use up scraps, so I've cut up. Some of mine are a little bit tapered at the end. If you're an experienced foundation piecer, go ahead and cut whatever shape you want to get your foundation covered. If you're a beginner, stick with the rectangles. So for the first piece, we're going to take our rectangle and lay it down. Make sure we're a 1/4 inch past the stitching line. We're going to take our second piece and lay it down face down. So what you want to have here, I can show you with this one. It's a little easier to see. That one's a batik. It's almost reversible. So this is the wrong side. We want right sides together on this first piece. And make sure you've got it 1/4 inch past on both seam lines. You can flip it over and double check to make sure. And you're actually going to stitch from this side. So hold it nice, hold it pretty firmly. Let's see, we're going to scoot this one up just a hair, just to make sure I get the whole arc covered up. And make sure I've got it down there. And I've got a little bit more than a 1/4 inch on both sides. I've got plenty at the top to make sure this darker one will pull over and cover this whole thing. And I'm going to stitch right along this line on my machine. I've sewn across my first seam line here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this back really nicely to help me fix the perforations, so later when I take it off, it rips nicely. This is an add a 1/4 ruler. You can see here it's got this little lip. It makes it really easy to do foundation paper piecing. I used to have another one and I misplaced it. This one came today, so I'm sure my old one will turn up any minute now. I'll probably step on it. So what I do is I line this lip up with the seam, and that gives me a good 1/4 inch seam allowance there. You can see I didn't have too much over. I was lined up pretty carefully, but I just trim along there. It just removes a little bit of excess bulk. All right, and then I'm going to press that. Get these things out of the way here, because I got to put my pressing mat up. So we will flip this open, flip that open, and it'll cover up. Because I did stitch it wrong the first time, of course, I know what I'm doing. I could do this in my sleep, but when I'm awake, I do it wrong the first time, every time. I've got this cute little iron, and I'm just going to press that open because I like a nice flat seam. All right. Pull these little threads out. They drive me bananas when I'm quilting. So I have to get them before my machine runs over them, or else it becomes harder to remove them. All right, so the next step, much the same as the first step, is lay. So first I want to see where this line is. So kind of fold the fabric back a little bit. And I want to make sure this piece, again, it extends a 1/4 inch past where I'm going to sew. So hold it there, flip it over. You can see it's here. It's past a 1/4 inch on this side, and it's past a 1/4 inch on this side. So I'm going to take that to my machine and sew it. Here I am. I've stitched along this line. Now I'm going to do the same thing as the first time. I'm going to press my sewn line back nice and tight. I'm also going to double check and make sure that my stitched fabric is over here on this side and doesn't go this way, because of course I've done it where, you know, some of the fabric is this way and I trim it and then I turn it back over and there's nothing there. So be careful when you're doing the trimming. Make sure everything is where it belongs before you line up and cut it off. I'm going to use my add a 1/4, my rotary cutter. Make sure your fingers are not on the wrong side of the ruler. It's harder to sew when you're bleeding. All right, you get this, and it flips nicely to cover the seam allowance there. It is okay to do finger pressing if you don't like taking everything to the ironing board. It's not actually as time consuming when you do chain piecing in multiple blocks at once. I happen to be a little bit anal retentive and really like to have everything pressed and flat and sharp lines. But if you're not like that, go with whatever works for you. So I've got my 4th piece, and this is a batik. It's a little bit harder to tell the right side from the wrong side. So I kind of finger press just to give myself a little bit of a shadow to work with. I'm going to line this up right side down, right where it needs to be. I'm going to flip it over and double check it to make sure that I'm about a 1/4 inch. I've got it lined up kind of far on this side. There we go. And I'm going to stitch right along this line here. So this line is stitched. I'm going to do the same thing again. Fold it back. Really press down that seam allowance. Make sure everybody's where they're supposed to be. Actually, I've got kind of a big seam allowance there, so I'm going to double check before I press it and make sure that I've got enough. Okay, and this template piece does have the seam allowance built in, so anything going right to the point there is okay. So get everybody where they need to be. Line up the add a 1/4 ruler to trim. Throw out the scraps. Flip it back over. And we have that. And grab my pressing mat. Give it a quick press. And it's just a coincidence that my little iron matches my blocks. Isn't it cute? I only have the one. When I do blocks that are not red, I will still be using the tiny red iron. So the next step is to flip it back over, grab my template, a pattern A template, and line it up. And for this trimming part, because it's a circle, I have I think it's a 28mm rotary cutter. It's a little tiny one. It gets around the curves a little bit better. Let's see if we can move that up. All right. And at this point, it's not so important to be lined up perfectly on your paper. If you end up trimming a little bit of the paper off, it's okay. It's more important to have it cut really exactly on a template. And I'm just going to turn that. And I'm going to use the big rotary cutter for this side. Because that little one does really nicely with curves. But for everything else, I like the big one. Okay, and there's the completed Part A unit. And the next step is another quick press. Because so many of these seams are bias edges, I mean, everything on here, I have in the past managed to line up the two end pieces so that they're kind of on grain. But it's tricky to do, especially if trying to use some scrap up. And this part up here is almost all bias. So I'm going to give it a quick spritz with some Niagara spray starch. I want to have it a little bit firmer so that the bias doesn't stretch as much when I'm piecing with the other curve. Of course it's going to stretch a little bit, but this will just help keep it, you know, prevent as many problems as possible. And this little iron is not really up to this job. Of course, I might have starched it a little heavy. Okay. That's good. So next is to remove our papers, because they're really just here to show us how to line everything up. Pull that out of there. The paper's a little damp. I'll give this one a final press before I stitch it to make sure it's all the way dry and firm. You can take little itty bitty stitches and reduce your stitch length when you're paper piecing. It does help to perforate the seam allowances when you want to get the paper out. The other thing that helps is this little offset tweezers. And grab those and pull them right out of there. And a little paper isn't going to matter too much when you're piecing it all together. But again, this is where my fussiness comes in. I like to get every little scrap out of there. All right, so the next step is to take the background piece, and I'm going to turn it this way, and you line it up. Now I've got my middle point marked here, and this seam is on the middle point. So I'm going to just line those up, drop in a pin, and drop in a pin at either end. And I usually like to add in a couple more. And this little middle bit here, it's kind of wild. But piecing the curves together, they definitely don't look like they're going to fit together. It looks like I've made a horrible mistake. Something is definitely wrong here. And when you get it onto your machine, it all just melts together perfectly. It's amazing. And it's so much easier than every time. It comes out so nicely, much better than I expected to. So definitely give it a try. And of course I'll try to film it, but one of my camera mounts seems to have gone missing. So that's what I'm going to take over to my sewing machine. And I'm just going to stitch 1/4 inch over here and see where this little bit, it comes apart a little bit. As you're sewing, just go slow and keep scooching it up so it is matched perfectly, and sew your 1/4 inch. And you'll be amazed at how nicely it comes together.
At least I still have these long shirts to wear.
Okay. Alright, so we're at the sewing machine. I've got my pieces loaded. I'm just going to show you how I stitch it. I'm going to hold on to the tails because my machine is fussy. Just do a little back stitch. I only really do that with curve piecing. I try not to sew over pins because my machine used to go around them nicely, but now she likes to hit them and then misbehave. Drop the needle. And as I go along, I just try to go slow and ease things in. I see like a little pucker form in there, and I just like to smooth it out. And it really does, oops, sorry about that. It really does come together quite nicely. Another little back stitch right at the end. And there's my curved piece all stitched. And you can see there's no, there's a little, looks like there might be a pucker there, but I'm pretty sure that one will press out. So it comes together nice. All right, and I'm going to take it over to the ironing board and press it. Here's my piece block. Not the one that I was working with first. This is a different one. I'll get my tiny iron and just press towards the background. Now, I did have a little bit of concern on this block that the way the circle is made, that I'm piecing towards the background, and the red, it might show through in the seam allowances. But I thought about doing a gray or a black background, and this red one was, the white was just, I felt what I needed. So there's that one complete. I've got my block here. It's all pieced together and pressed nicely. There's an important step that we need to do, and that is square off the block. Let me see if I can scoot up to avoid the glare. Yeah. Sorry about the glare from the lights. So to square it off, I'm going to line up my outer corner here, right on the point of the ruler. Make sure that my diagonal line is right along the stitch line in my pieces. And I'm just going to trim off a tiny bit off of that. This bit will probably be more. And I'm going to line up with my 6.5 inch mark and make sure everything is nice and straight on there. I'm going to square it off. And that makes sure that at the end, my block is actually 12 inches. I guess these templates are made to have a little bit of excess. But I try to keep as much in the white part as possible, because I do want to have that. If you trim off too much, then your circle will disappear. Well, it'll touch the edge of your block, and for this quilt, I don't want that. Oh, this one. See, now this one, I guess when I stitched, I did it before I decided I was just going to have 4 rays. So this one has 5. So the middle line isn't nicely done there, but I can see where it should be. So this is 6.5. I'm just going to line up again with that outer edge and trim off a very small amount. There can be a little bit of wobbling in the seams when piecing the circle. That's why the squaring off is important. And get it lined up again. And I'll do this for the other 2 sections as well. And what I'll do then is take these two and line them up this way and see how that matches up nicely. Put them right sides together and pin. And I'll drop a pin in right at the corner there. And I will match up those seam points and drop a pin right there to make sure that they are permanently attached. And I'm going to do another pin, not right at the corner there, but more here, so that I can grab that seam allowance on the back. Sometimes what will happen is that the back one, the seam allowance, as I'm going through the machine, will flip down. And when you're trying to quilt, if your seams are pressed part this way and part that way, when you try to do a stitch in the ditch quilting, it's really hard to maintain that. So you need to make sure that your seams are all going in this correct direction. And I'll just drop one more pin in here because I am a compulsive pinner. And then I'll stitch along that line, and I'll do the same for the other two pieces. So here I have my two finished blocks, or my two finished half block units. And they're going to go together like this. It's important when pressing them. I like with blocks like this I'm going to press these ones to one side. So I am going to press this one this way. I'm constructing them with a thought to the final seam allowance. So this seam, the bulk is on this side. This one, I'm going to press it in the other direction so that the bulk is going that way. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me a point in the center where I can nest my seams. Okay. Just love that silly little iron. So these two are going to go together. You can see my seams are going to nest there so that I don't have quite as much bulk when I'm quilting. Although with this block I will definitely pay attention to it and not hit it when I'm quilting. So what I'm going to do is I am going to drop a pin in at 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch down on either one, and I'm going to go through the seam allowance. And I'm just going to let that pin sit there. It is going to make sure that when my sewing machine needle comes through, actually I'm going to use a shorter pin. I'm going to leave it standing up like that. And I'm going to make sure when my sewing machine goes through that my needle goes through the same exact hole that the pin is in. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to stop stitching a couple of stitches away, and then I'm going to use my flywheel on the side of my machine and turn it and help guide the needle right into this exact spot, because that is where I want those two blocks to be put together and stay together forever. And I'll show you that will lead to a perfect seam. Okay, see now when I open it, my horizontal lines meet and my vertical lines meet. And the way I'm going to press this to try to distribute the bulk a little bit is to try to spin the center a little bit. And there's no way my machine's going to want to go through this anyways. There's just way too many pieces of fabric coming through. There should be 16, but because I had one piece, I don't know what I was doing, there's 17 points coming together. So that's just too much. I've heard that I can hit it with a rubber mallet. I don't know that I'm going to give that a try, because I think that would mean I'd need to go buy a rubber mallet. I'm pretty sure there's not one out in the garage. But, so there you have it. That is my 12-inch block. Here it is, my finished block. This is the first block of a series of 12 for a circle play quilt. If you decide to make this block, go ahead and tag me on Instagram or Facebook. I'm Jen Strouser on Instagram and Dizzy Quilter on Facebook. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. See you next month.